everyone, and welcome to Call Your Hits, a Storm Riders Airsoft podcast. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Today, Pat and I are going to be discussing a topic that has come up a few times recently, and in a way, it's something we've been thinking about for a while, and namely, is Airsoft pay to win? It's important before we go into this to define what pay to win means. So if you're not familiar with this term, pay to win is a concept that comes from video games that have in-game currencies where players can use real-world money to buy mechanical advantage by way of microtransactions. I'd say most of our listeners are familiar, but just to be safe, we're going to go through it real quick.
No reason not to explain it.
Yeah. So these advantages that people can buy with money are in some cases often so powerful that it makes it significantly harder or impossible for players to stay competitive without spending money. Now, that doesn't mean that people who spend that money on the game will always win regardless against people who don't, but rather it makes the game really stall out your progress unless you're willing to spend some real money. Now, not all pay-to-win models are like this, or not all microtransaction models are like this, I should say. Some are only cosmetic-based. We're talking here about those where you get in-game advantage. And the reason why we think about this in the context of Airsoft is you often see people using very expensive, heavily modified equipment that is quite costly. So just to give you an example, Pat's HBA setup that he's been talking about for a while is, near on or over $1,000 and provides some excellent performance, especially in comparison to much cheaper options. So in a way, by virtue of spending money, he now has an airsoft gun that has mechanical advantages compared to others that perhaps did not spend that kind of money. So does that make Airsoft pay to win? And that's really what we're going to be talking about today.
And this is, to be honest, one of the oldest conversations in Airsoft for us. Because I remember, very shortly after I started playing, after I'd bought my first gun, we had people playing with us who were using, the Walmart brand M4, right? And so for those who aren't from Canada, in case those are a Canadian exclusive thing, I don't really know. I've never checked, if I'm being honest. Right. That is an M4 that runs on AA batteries, is made of clear plastic. You could probably shoot one of our modern guns, could probably shoot through one at close range, if I'm being honest. They had a mostly plastic gearbox, including plastic gears, and just a tremendously low rate of fire and a tremendously low FPS. And at the time, I remember people going, well, it really sucks playing with these. I can't win.
Yeah, I remember there was a period of time where we would set up the teams based on the AEGs that were present. Right. So we would have like 6 or let's say 8 people, and we would take, we would divide it up and say, okay, well, we've got 4 good guns and 4 crap guns. So we'll put 2 good guns on each side and 2 crap guns on each side. It didn't matter who was using them. It's just mechanically one was substantially superior to the other. Right.
And at the time, I have a weird sort of dichotomy even then, because at the time I certainly didn't feel that my setup was pay to win. I regularly, back in those 6 and 8 player days, I regularly swapped with someone who was using one of the Walmart guns, really just to prove that, yeah, you could beat someone using a much, much better AEG. Frankly, almost infinitely better.
Yeah, really.
If you, sort of played correctly and sort of applied some skills. And that was definitely true to a point. So pay to win, no. But in 2007, yeah, Airsoft was definitely a game where if you had $700 or $500 to spend on a gun, you had a huge advantage over people who were buying, at the time, really the 2 most available things in Canada were Kraken brand AKs, which were a fully plastic bodied AK, but with a metal version 3 gearbox. So they were
Man, that takes me
actually
back.
a moderately okay gun. Or Walmart brand M4s, or like, a spring shotgun or a spring pistol from Walmart. Modern airsoft, I'm going to say thankfully, and let's be real, thankfully, is a very different animal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question.
A G&G combat machine, right? They're just their base model, your $200 Canadian walk into any airsoft store in Canada and pick it up. M4 is better than all of those.
Yeah.
It performs better. It has better range. It has better accuracy. It has better rate of fire. It deals with batteries better. There's no thing that is not superior on that gun to those. So I think that aspect of things has fallen off.
Yeah, and when you think about it, like not just for airsoft, but really for any hobby whatsoever, there is this sort of threshold of entry, which isn't to say that you can't do whatever hobby it is with the very base equipment that you're showing up with, even if it's not appropriate. And so from that standpoint, you could say, oh, well, we're not operating at the same level because other people have a mechanical advantage. So let's talk about, for example, a couple of different examples. So let's talk about running, right? You might have like old beat up running shoes, sneakers, trainers, whatever you want to call them, in your closet, and you show up to 1,000-meter race with someone who's wearing carbon plated shoes, which are like the top shelf go fast shoes these days. You're not comparing apples to apples, right? Does that mean that you can't necessarily compete? Well, it's going to be a lot harder for you because you don't have the right equipment. And if you have the right skills, you might be able to do just fine, but you're starting off on an uneven playing field. Same thing if you were to consider, autocross, which I did for, a few years back when I was starting to play airsoft as well. I'm showing up there in my 2010 Toyota Yaris, all-wheel drive automatic. And there's, somebody there driving a Porsche, 911 turbo. Like, yeah, I certainly can show up and I certainly can compete. Am I likely going to win? Probably not, because I'm not showing up with that sort of right baseline of equipment.
And I think the fortunate thing is that the margins are not that wide in airsoft. In airsoft, like we can talk about this, or I think I would like to talk about this really in a barrier for entry kind of way first. So if you look at, okay, so I want to start playing airsoft. If I go buy a, G&G combat machine and no mags because it comes with a high cap and show up to play, then am I just going to get rocked by people who have really expensive guns?
I mean, probably the first time, let's be honest, right?
But not necessarily because you bought a combat machine, right? Not because you bought a $200 gun, right? So if you show up,
I'm just being cheeky.
No, and I mean that's fine, right? Well, if you show up at Frontline, right? If you show up here at our field and you are playing against me with a combat machine, and I'm rocking my M27, and I'm actually going to go through a little later in this episode everything that's in it, because a couple of people have mentioned that like they'd like an episode in which we talked about the actual practical cost for a couple of our builds. And I think this is a good place to work that in. I think this is a good place to discuss that a little bit. So yeah, there are good odds that I'm going to make your day hard. Like if we are one-on-one, just luck of the draw, we end up opposite each other on the field for much of the day, you're going to have a hard time. But that's because it's your first airsoft game. You're going to have a hard time your first airsoft game if you're playing against veteran players, right?
Yeah.
Unless you come from, a military background or a policing background or something. But like the average Joe who's like, oh, I think this is a cool hobby, I think this is a cool sport, I'm going to get into it today, is going to find that, yeah, like veteran players are going to beat you up, and veteran players often have expensive guns. If we take the veteran player out of the equation, when we go, okay, well, what's the cost differential in terms of my ability to play effectively if I buy a CM16 Raider, say, and someone else goes and buys a $1,000 HPA setup? I think the answer there is not as big as you'd expect. We all, everyone on the Storm Riders team runs fairly accurized, fairly upgraded to massively upgraded setups. because we've been playing for a really long time, so we've had the money to put into it over a fair number of years. Because we've had, myself included, a couple of really good gun techs on the team, and those gun techs have tended to work for substantially below market for teammates, if you if you want to interpret it that way. So like, there are benefits there, but realistically, if you give Phil or I an unupgraded AEG, after we reset our brains, because that's the big part we're going to have to do, to go, oh, okay, so this is the accuracy and range of the thing I'm using. I'm going to have to adjust my playstyle that way. Will be fairly effective. Probably not as effective as with the, gun I've built for Phil or the gun I've built for myself, because we have a fair number of hours on those and a fair amount of experience using them. But, it's not going to make us ineffective players. So
on the flip side, though, it will absolutely mean that we're going to have to work harder.
100%.
Right? So I think when you think about this sort of in the broader picture, if you were to give Cal or a CM16 Raider and he had to go head to head with you, is he going to lose every time? No. Right. And that's why I think we can say with a relative degree of confidence that pay to win is not really so much a thing in Airsoft, because there's a skill differential that comes into play. Right. I think you touched on this, like, how much better does a good player get when you give them good equipment? Not as much. Right. Like, obviously it makes their job easier, but they're still perfectly capable of executing without that good equipment. And that would be true of anyone in any sport. I mean, if you were to take, a tennis pro like a Rafael Nadal or whatever and give him a crappy racket, can he suddenly no longer play or compete? Of course not. Right? He's still very, very good. And similarly, like, you take a guy like Johnny or Cal or Chris, like guys who are like extremely aggressive, that push a lot, who understand playing within their own limits, right? If you give them crappy equipment, they'll make do. And if you gave them good equipment, they will also make do. And the only thing that changes is the amount of effort that's required of them in order to be able to compete. But they still can. It's not sort of like I have no option at this point, right? Now, are there scenarios when you're hitting the airsoft field where that mechanical advantage can turn completely on your head? And I mean, certainly if the scenario that you're playing is a scenario that is a single lane of fire. So you've got defenders at one end, they can only approach one way, and all those defenders have, super upgraded AEGs that are shooting 200 feet, accurately, and everyone on your team has Raiders. You're going to have a rough day, and it's quite unlikely that you're going to be able to shoot to succeed. But that is not, like, I would say, a typical type of airsoft game. I'd say one of the things Pat and I were talking about in the lead up to this episode, where we do see sort of a more pay to win dynamic, is certainly with stuff like night vision, right? If you're showing up to a night game and you have no night vision and someone has dropped $13,000 Canadian or more on thermals, well, this is a mechanical advantage that you cannot overcome. Right? It's not possible for you to see in the dark unless you have night vision equipment, right? That is a whole thing that militaries around the world are relying on when they're executing, military operations in the dead of night, that their opponents can't see and they can, right? There's no way for you to overcome that.
Yeah, I mean, if you're playing Airsoft at night and you're playing against people who have the income to buy thermals or an NVG and a pack box, like, especially if they've got more than one player who has that kind of money, yeah, I mean, you're hosed.
But that's not the typical airsoft scenario. Like, the typical airsoft skirmish. I mean, Shane showed up with night vision the other day, but it was like a Sunday afternoon, bro. Like, what are you doing? But that's beside the point.
Looking cool.
Like that, your typical airsoft game where you're engaging in a skirmish and stuff like that. I don't see a whole lot of space for, like, a direct pay to win.
So there is one,
right?
Like, I've been thinking about this for the last couple of days, and from a game mechanics point of view, if you asked me to break Airsoft in a pay to win sense, I absolutely can do it in a normal game. But obviously my answer is going to be a little cheeky. So we talk a lot about how a new player with a high cap and a raider is a useful player to have on your team. Yeah. They can provide suppressing fire. They can, if they have the right mindset, if they move, if they play effectively, they're extremely useful. So can I pay to win Airsoft? Yeah, I can pay $100 to bring 5 guys who rent those guns who are going to play effectively. And even if they're new players who are going to use cover, move, be aggressive, flank, awesome. That to me is, yeah, I can pay money to get a mechanical advantage as long as we're all on the same team every game. But that's pretty much it.
And that's not really what we're talking about. Like, we're talking about, like, how can you, if someone is willing to spend $5,000 on their airsoft equipment, does that necessarily mean that mechanically they have an edge to win every engagement? And, we've talked a little bit, and we can certainly get into the HPA setup and what you've done with your rifle. But and I think, it's worth thinking about just taking a step backwards here for a second. I think the vast majority of us who play Airsoft want to believe that Airsoft is not pay to win.
Definitely.
Right? We're coming at it from a standpoint of there's no way our hobby is pay to win, because I would say, I mean, if you're anything like we are, you don't really want to feel like, oh, well, the only reason that we are so advanced here is because we've spent all this money on good quality equipment. And while there is absolutely a factor of good quality equipment helping us be more effective on the field, that's not the only factor. So we're really definitely coming at it with a bias towards no, it's not, trying to find scenarios where we might say, yes, it is, right?
Totally. And, I mean, obviously the scenario that I outlined a minute ago is very cheeky, right? And it isn't the point of the question, but I feel like you have to engage in sort of sideways thinking in order to get a useful answer here, because at the end of the day, mindset and skill are very firmly what I believe makes a good player. I want players to have a reliable AEG. Mm-hmm. I have said a bunch of times privately, and I've probably said it on the podcast at some point, but like, if you're going to give me a choice between a player with an unupgraded, especially bolt action rifle, even a pretty good player, or a player who is moderately okay with an AEG, I'll take the player with the AEG. And like, if you guys want to mail me Norwich so he can kick my ass until I believe otherwise, then go ahead. But, practically speaking, there are definitely advantages you can gain by spending money in Airsoft, even outside of looking at the crazily upgraded sniper rifle or HPA setup, or, as we already talked about, the night vision. So if you're attending a regular game of Airsoft and you're trying to quote unquote pay to win, pay for advantage, can you? Yeah, definitely. Right. In the sense that a player who has some money to spend is going to have stuff that a player who doesn't have money to spend would benefit from. So having a chest rig or other load bearing equipment with pouches that are, well made, that contain mags, is a lot easier and definitely gives you mechanical advantage over a player who is there in, a tracksuit who's holding their mags in their pockets. Can you hold your mags in your pockets? Absolutely. Can you use those mags effectively? Yes. Is it a little slower than ripping a mag out of a well-made, well-placed chest rig that you've practiced with? Yeah. If you and I are doing just like your gun is empty, reload, whoever gets the shot in first wins, and you're pulling out of your pockets and I'm pulling out of the mags on my vest that I've practiced pulling out of, you're probably going to lose. Mm-hmm. But you're not going to lose every time. I'm not that fast. Chris, you have an even lower chance of winning, but you're still not going to win. You have an even lower chance of winning, but he's still not going to win every time. So can you pay for an advantage there? Yeah. Buying gear that is, good LBE gives you an advantage. If it didn't give you an advantage, forces all over the world wouldn't use the stuff. Right.
Yeah. And I think this comes back to what you were talking about earlier about like sort of the barrier for entry, and not really the barrier for entry, but like, what is sort of the minimum threshold that you have to look at before we can even start considering whether or not we're actually comparing apples to apples, right? Because, to someone who is renting their airsoft gun for the first time, looking at all this money that they need to invest if they're going to be able to compete. Well, that's, again, kind of like saying, oh, well, I need, sneakers to be able to play basketball, or I need, shorts or whatever. Same idea. Like, there is some equipment. And we always say, like, listen, if you want to play airsoft, all you need is an airsoft gun, an iPro, some BBs, and like a battery, right? Like, that's really all you need. But if you really want to be effective and be an effective team member, there's things that you are going to need. That doesn't mean you can't be effective without them, but some things that, like you were just saying, give you an advantage that has nothing to do with being pay to win, but more having to do with you're really going to need these in order to be able to play successfully. And load bearing equipment is certainly one of them. I believe knee pads are another one, as are, like appropriate footwear.
Definitely.
Like those kinds of things. Like, is an optic one of them? No, I don't believe an optic is, right? Is a, suppressor? Obviously not. LMG? Obviously not, right? All those little bits and bobs that you would bolt on in some way, shape, or form, I don't necessarily feel would be part and parcel to that sort of entry, But in order for us to be able to even have the conversation of like, is this thing pay to win? Well, is it paid to win compared to other people who have like a standardized set versus someone who has nothing? Well, obviously, yes. Like if you're comparing LBE versus no LBE, well, yeah, that's a different story. But I wouldn't think that that's part of this conversation that we're ultimately really, when we're looking at the pay to win argument and discussion, I don't think that really factors, right?
So I think it's useful to talk about.
No, I don't disagree, but I think that what I'm getting at is ultimately, like, when we're looking at what makes a baseline airsofter, there's a few things, right? Chest rig or plate carrier, like those kinds of things. Almost every single airsofter is eventually going to gravitate towards that, and I think that's more of like your standard kit, let's call it, rather than the pay to win aspect.
Totally. But if we're going to talk about this, one of the things I think it's necessary to talk about is, so what does a walk in the door basic airsoft kit look like, right? Mm-hmm. So to me, you're $100-ish for a decent pair of hiking boots, right? Probably 80 CAD to buy some sort of moderately all right tactical vest on Amazon or eBay or wherever. $200 for a Raider and $40 for iPro, and I guess, let's say $60 for a couple of mags so that you actually have something to put in the tactical vest. Because realistically, you don't need the tactical vest if you're just going to run a single high cap. But there are, I think, genuine positive arguments for having some mid caps to toss in there, even if you keep the high cap as the primary thing you're running, just because you don't have to wind them.
And then, your BBs, batteries, and I think as well, like, honorable mention to some sort of like surplus OD battle dress uniform of some sort.
For sure.
For like camo. Because again, like, you talk about sort of mechanical advantage. Well, it's not really a mechanical advantage. It's just you should be wearing camo if you're playing airsoft of some sort. Like, because we know what the impact is. If you show up and you're just wearing a purple hoodie or whatever, that's not going to go great for you, right?
And I mean, there are a bunch of sort of videos about like camo effectiveness. We have one on our YouTube channel you can go look at. One of the things that I found the most surprising when we did that was not that, some of the camos didn't work in our environment or whatever. It was that just head to toe olive drab, like an olive drab jumpsuit, some sort of, olive drab hat and a pair of gloves is way more effective than the same in black or navy or whatever. So the relative ease with which you can go, yeah, I'm just going to be significantly more concealable because I went to my local army surplus and bought a olive drab jumpsuit is astonishing. Right. So I don't think camo is a barrier to entry for airsoft. I don't think camo is a pay to win situation. I think having the most expensive, most Gucci camouflage that's the best for your region for any given, time of year is super helpful if you're playing in the woods.
Yeah, obviously.
But I don't think it is game breaking. Right. And that's really kind of what we're talking about here is, can I pay to break this game? Can I pay to make this game unfairly good for me and unfun for my opponents? So Camo, probably not a factor, right? Good pair of hiking boots, oddly enough, I think kind of is a factor if you're playing long games, long milsim, because we've definitely won milsim games on our opponents being dead on their feet and uncomfortable and not willing to put in the energy and having low morale. But again, I'm not really thinking that's what we're talking about here, and I mean, we're working towards, guys, anyone who's listening and going, why haven't they talked about expensive guns yet? That's where this is going, but we wanted to get in some sort of so what does a basic setup look like? Okay, what does a median kind of setup look like, right? We've talked about where we think you should go from there a whole bunch in terms of how to upgrade your AEG. So you've spent $400 getting into Airsoft, right? You've bought some sort of hiking boots that are decent, some sort of iPro that's decent, a Raider, OD camo, battery, BBs, something that we'll charitably call a vest, right? Mm-hmm. And to be fair, for all that I'm being snarky, I have run a Chicom $20 from eBay AK chest rig with a borrowed AK, and that is fine.
Yeah, totally. 100%.
I have paid a fair amount of money for my chest rig. It's set up just the way I like it. I've been picky about it, but I have, 15 years of airsofting experience that allows me to know what I want specifically and to be picky. I also have, over that time, a bunch of iterations of a budget invested in that kit, so I can tell you, oh man, I really like these Slickster low drag, high speed mag pouches. They're great. I am not telling you need them.
Yeah.
Do they make my draw faster? No, honestly. The primary reason I like them is that they collapse down when I take the mag out of them and they're not in the way when I try to go prone later. Is that advantage? Absolutely. Does it come up every single game? Absolutely not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure.
Does having some sort of chest rig to put your mags in on give you a better chance of winning any given protracted engagement in Airsoft? Absolutely. There you go.
So I guess my question for you is when we're talking about this and sort of to carry this discussion forward, how can we say with honesty that Airsoft is not pay to win when the guy's showing up to the Airsoft field with the basic Airsoft kit and you're showing up to the Airsoft field with your rifle, which is conservatively twice as expensive as his entire kit put together? Right? Because if we were to break down the cost of your HPA, and I think maybe now we break that cost down, that's not cheap, right? You've got just the body of your gun is more expensive than a CM16 Raider.
I mean,
right?
So I have chosen a specifically terrible base body to start working with because IARs are rare and expensive in and of themselves. They weren't made a ton, and I wanted a VFC one because Polar Star stuff plays really well with VFC external and internal components. But yeah, so factually, just the gun that I used as the base build, the AEG I bought to start taking parts out of to build my HPA setup, cost more than that beginner's Airsoft setup we rattled through. Mm-hmm. And the question is valid. So if that's true and I've done that, and I don't think that's an insane thing to have done, then how can I possibly justify the argument that I'm not paying to win? So the first thing is, honestly, I do think that's an insane thing I've done.
Yes, I mean, yeah.
Practically speaking, I could have bought a VFC M4 for $400 instead of a $900 gun body to start building off of. I just like the 416 in general and want a long gun. So,
but even for argument's sake, let's assume that you had bought the $400 body instead of the $900.
And it's still irrelevant because then I put a fusion engine.
Yeah, exactly.
In it, and that fusion engine is $200 more again than the kit that we listed off as a basic beginner kit. The cool thing is for the new players and the players who are sort of like, oh, I don't want this game to be pay to win. So the fusion engine, speaking as a gun tech and someone who's, I guess, starting to be sort of knowledgeable about HPA stuff, is fantastic. It doesn't actually give better performance out of the box, I think, than an upgraded AEG. I don't really feel that the IAR is hugely better than my previous rifle, which had the same inner barrel length and a really well upgraded AEG gearbox in it, and a max hop up and all that jazz. Like they're very parallel. There are benefits to the HPA setup in terms of my ability to tune it is different. And if you are looking at Airsoft and going, man, I really want a tunable gun. I want to be able to tweak a lot of stuff on this. And especially if you want to do it on the fly. Any Polar Star unit with an electronic FCU is really quite cool there. You can do stuff with them that you just factually cannot do on an AEG. Partly because they are digital and allow for percentage values, right? You cannot change, like you can change the ratio of the gears, but other than changing the ratio of the gears, you cannot change how the gears work on an AEG, right? So you have to work in something much closer to analog and to whole numbers when you're doing AEG tuning. I'm pretty convinced at this point that if you buy a Fusion engine and buy the max hop up that's meant to go with it and put in an R-hopped barrel and do all the work, you get a really accurate, really excellent Airsoft gun. Very sure. I have a couple more parts coming that'll ostensibly make it even better. I'll keep you posted. But at this point, I have spent probably half again as much as I spent on my excellent AEG build for pretty comparable performance. Partly I did this because I was curious and I wanted to see what I could do with the HPA build. I enjoy tinkering with these things, and figuring out what I can do is kind of fun. Figuring out what I can do with HPA has been really fun, let's be honest. But I'm still shooting a spherical projectile that has the aerodynamics of a ball out of a flat, smooth bored barrel. And the fact that the air that's propelling it is coming out of a HPA tank rather than out of a AEG gearbox cycling doesn't really change the fact that at the end of the day, the physics of an airsoft projectile is only going so far, right? Mm-hmm. So, can I do a bunch of things with this that are valuable for me? Yeah, totally. Both in terms of tuning it and in terms of play, right? One of the things I like about this setup is if I want to run my gun as a high FPS DMR rifle for a day or even for a couple of games, I can pull the stock off, adjust 3 settings, pull the tank out of my backpack, adjust 1 setting, and be good to go. The only thing I'll have to do is get the ref to rechrono me and confirm that I'm firing semi-semi instead of semi and semi-auto. So great, easy, right? Does that provide me mechanical advantage? It provides me with an advantage over AEGs for my own desire to be able to swap playstyles if I want to. That's cool. But, I don't end every game as the last guy standing.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the funny things, and I guess we'll talk about this now just because it seems like a good point to talk about it. So I'm a big, scary looking dude with a big, scary looking gun that everyone knows has a lot of reach and a lot of accuracy. And that means that boy, oh boy, do I get a lot of love. Mm-hmm. Right? So can you pay to win Airsoft? I don't know. Maybe I'm paying to lose Airsoft. I'm certainly paying to get shot at a lot.
Well, I think this comes back to the foundational question, which is, of course, that when people see airsofters on the field and they have all this expensive equipment, they are automatically assuming that those people are more of a threat as a result of the equipment that they have, right? And so, you look at your HPA setup, it was $2,000, let's say. I mean, you're definitely well over $1,000, right? And if we're looking at it from a standpoint of, let's assume it was a standard M4 and not the IAR that you have, you're looking at $1,500 or whatever. Like how can you look at someone who has a setup like that and say, okay, well, how is that not pay to win? The reality, of course, is that the people you're going up with, they don't really know how much you've spent on it. They just know, hey, you've got all of these things, and like, wow, you've got this whole setup. And so from their perspective, you're just doing, you're going to do much. I mean, I was going to say much worse. I mean, from their perspective, much worse, much better things on the field than they are going to be able to do. And this sort of ties into something you said earlier, which is that, if you have that mindset of understanding and playing within your limits and stuff like that, you're going to be able to overcome that sort of adversity. On the flip side, we talked about this a lot. Like, there is a non-negligible effect on players when they see stuff like that and they go, like, someone shows up with an LMG and they go, oh my God, it's an LMG. Or you've got a guy in a ghillie suit with a bolt action sniper, go, oh my God, the sniper, I got to look out for them, without knowing anything about that particular player, their performance, their ability on the field. But what really, I mean, is the biggest factor of all of this, and you've talked about it just now, is that just because you have spent all of this money does not mean that other players can't make you pay for it in some way, shape, or form, not with actual money, but with lots and lots of BBs or what have you. And B, does not also necessarily mean that you have the skills to back up whatever your dollar investment is, right? We consistently talk about this idea of, outperforming your equipment, or your equipment outperforming you. And we talk a lot about how airsoft guns aren't very accurate, and there's a bit of a wing in it factor and all this kind of stuff. But the reality is, in that some cases, your airsoft gun is perfectly accurate, and you're not being as accurate with that gun as you could be. And whether that's a $200 gun or a $2,000 gun, that factor is still the same. So if you take a brand new beginner and give them a $2,000 your setup, for example, they're not going to be able to utilize all $2,000 worth that you've put into it. So in that particular respect too, it's not going to be pay to win, right?
Yeah, I mean, like, the setup that I'm rocking, I mean, honestly, I'm still working out the kinks from a training point of view, from a practice point of view, right? So, the HPA line does not foul up my shoulder side transitions, but it changes them. I am still at the point where I have to be aware of it and conscious of it while I'm doing those transitions. That's a year in. With an AEG, I do not have that issue. I think that's a worthwhile balance to work out, but there it is. I am using a really nice magnified optic. That takes practice. That takes getting used to. It takes, frankly, as much practice and getting used to as being effective with irons or a red dot does. Because you can say, oh yeah, you just put the red dot over someone and pull the trigger. And sure, if you're 50 feet away. But if you're 50 feet away, you can just walk your BBs onto them as well pretty effectively.
And someone with a CM16 radar would have been able to do the exact same thing also.
Exactly, right? So, you don't gain, to my mind, a real edge there. If you look at, the equivalent sort of comparison at long ranges, yeah, so I have a magnified optic, an R-hopped barrel, and a long rifle. I definitely have the advantage, especially at the extreme edges of the ranges of what my airsoft gun and, say, Phil's can do. But practically speaking, like talking about the pay to win thing, so one of those players in our really early airsoft games ran a M4 carbine that he had sent away. At the time, there were no really good gun techs here, and he had mailed it away to get it teched. He was running a 203. He had grenades for it. He was definitely running the most expensive setup in the province at the time, like bar nothing. Yeah. But if we're being honest, he really couldn't rock it. he wasn't really upper body strength fit enough to deal with the weight of that setup, which is, a thing that's worth mentioning. I ran one for ages. You have to be half strong to run a 203 and keep your primary function of your rifle on target easily. It's heavy. Do you have to hit the gym every day? No. Do you have to lift your gun up? Yes. And I'm not saying this to to shit on that guy in any way. It's just sort of buying stuff doesn't necessarily make it work for you. I can toss my entire HPA setup at Phil, and honestly, he'll probably have a fun game running it, I think, because it's very different from what he runs, and it's quite tuned, and he likes guns that are quite tuned. But Phil's going to have to adjust to a line that he's not used to and not comfortable with, and he's going to have to adjust to a magnified optic that he's not used to and not comfortable with. So is he going to be Johnny on the spot and just, completely crush it with that? No. Is he going to be as effective as I am with it, even at this point? No. Is Phil a better airsofter than I am? Yeah, probably. Let's be honest. He plays more often than I do. And he is very motivated and plays very aggressively. But the example I was going to use when we were talking earlier about just, people look at you and go, oh man, he must be a huge threat. Right. So if you stand Johnny and I next to one another at an airsoft game, especially lately, right? Johnny is a skinny dude with an M4 wearing some sort of Denison on top and some sort of Hawaiian shorts on the bottom. I am a big scary looking dude in camo with a huge gun with HPA line on it and visibly a magnified optic. When people are trying to figure out where to go on the airsoft field, they are going to try to avoid me and they're going to go to John. And that is a mistake. Again, he plays more than I do. He's a really aggressive player. He is an extremely skilled player. And I'm not saying I'm a terrible player, right? Do not get me wrong. I'm pretty okay at airsoft. But they're definitely making a choice based on the fact that I look big and intimidating and have a big intimidating gun. That's not necessarily the right one. Do I think it's worthwhile to upgrade your gear? Yes, absolutely. Right. Which is weird because, doesn't that mean it's pay to win? Yes, sure. If that's how you want to interpret that sentence. And I think you can make the argument, you can pay to get direct, definite mechanical advantage, right? You can pay me money if you live in Newfoundland, to make your airsoft gun a gun where when you put the, whatever reticle you are using over the person and pull the trigger twice, you'll probably hit them with 1 out of 2, which is about as good as I feel you can make an airsoft gun.
But I think, we've talked a fair amount about the pay in pay to win, right? And once again, if I compare this to having carbon plated running shoes, for instance, you can pay money to get a pair of those shoes, but that doesn't mean that you have the foundational skills to be able to utilize them. And then I think there's a second part here in pay to win, which is win, right? What does it actually mean to win, right? Especially in the context of airsoft. It's different when you look at other sports where there's a podium, right? There's a very clear advantage. There's a very clear distinction of what it means to win. You either end up on the podium or you don't. But for us at a typical airsoft game, yes, you could look at it in the narrow definition of win, I paid money and therefore I'm going to win this skirmish, right? But if you're trying to think about what does it mean to win at airsoft in air quotes in a broader context, we've talked many times in the past that winning games does not mean that you're winning at airsoft. And in fact, you can build a highly accurized HPA setup like Pat's, and you can sit very far back and you can smoke renters all day long, right? You can basically, watch their spawn with your magnified optic 200 feet away and just start doming them all day long. Is that winning? Well, that's exactly right. So you've paid all this money to get all this mechanical advantage, and now you can just, dome people all day long from, 200 feet away. That doesn't sound appealing to me as a player. I'm I don't want to be in those situations.
I'm not here doing it, right? So
exactly.
It's funny because really, when we sat down to talk about this, especially when we initially were spitballing about this before we did any real chatting about it, was my answer was no, you can't pay to win. But as I define winning airsoft, you absolutely can. it turns out, because I pretty consistently, I think, have said on this podcast and elsewhere that for me, winning Airsoft is having fun, right? Having fun is what I'm there to do. I don't have to win every scenario. I don't have to get the most kills. Like, I have played lots of games where I had a blast just suppressing the enemy team and making their lives miserable. And my team won because I was doing that and it was effective. And so were other people on my team.
Mm-hmm.
You can do that with an AUG that doesn't function. Ask me how I know. You can do that with, the CM16. Last year, I did that during a game with a M249 that didn't have the barrel fully inserted into it. But it was still putting rounds vaguely in the right direction and at some sort of velocity, and it kept heads down.
Yeah, totally.
So am I paying you in? Yeah, I'm having a blast with my HPA setup. Partly, yeah, because it's a very effective build. It does exactly what I wanted to performance wise. But, partly because I just have a laugh playing with it. And again, that's sort of a cheeky answer in the sense that it's not quite what people mean. But to loop back to sort of the real answer, I know that if you put Phil's gun, John's gun, my gun and Cal's gun in the hands of 4 renters and we just swap, they're not going to curb stomp us. We are not going to get wrecked, especially if they're 4 players who just showed up for their first day. Give them 6 months of playing and it will get a lot harder for us.
To make the comparison fair, I mean, if we were to say, like, you and Cal versus me and John, right? And you two have raiders and we have good accurized rifles, right? So, veteran players who are going up against each other. I still don't think that we, with the better rifles, are going to curb stop you. Because again, this is, at the end of the day, like when we talk about, is this pay to win? Well, just because you have the good equipment does not necessarily mean that the delta between you with the crappy gear, for lack of a better term, versus the other people with the good gear is that wide.
Yeah, well, I mean,
right?
Like, take me running the Garand, or John running any of his World War II gear, right?
Or his AK, which is crappy, right?
Yeah, like, if you toss me on the field with the Garand, people still need to be concerned that I'm out there shooting at them. Now, I mean, we've talked before about the fact that the Garand is surprisingly good for a stock gun, but at the end of the day, it is a stock AEG. It has 0 upgrades in it, has 0 tuning done to it, and it is functionally a M14.
Yeah.
So if I think look at an M14 and go, oh man, I can buy an M14. All right, they work. You're good. Do you need to spend money on upgrades to be effective? No.
Yeah, I think that's the key takeaway for people listening to this, especially, I mean, obviously, if you're into Airsoft, you are going to end up spending money on Airsoft, right? Like, it's a fact of life, right? Hey, Jordan, this part is for you, right? You start playing Airsoft for a year, and then next thing you know, you've got all these different guns, all this different gear, because it's a cool hobby. It's fun to collect and stuff. But the takeaway is that when you are looking at what you want to do for Airsoft, you shouldn't be asking yourself, rather, what do I need to buy in order to compete? That should not really be a question that fits in your thinking when you're looking at this. Are you going to want to upgrade your gun? Absolutely. That's just going to, at least for my experience and talking to people, once you start using a stock gun, stuff may break, stuff may get worn, and you may say, okay, well, I want to put a new barrel in there. That's why we talk about how to upgrade guns. That's why, people like Pat as a gun tech have, this side hustle, and because people want to do that kind of stuff. But it should never come from a place of, I must do this. Otherwise, I can't keep having fun. Otherwise, I can't keep playing Airsoft. I can't keep being competitive. The reality is that if you feel that way, something else might be going on, because you should be able to have fun with working equipment and everything in your environment without feeling the need to say, no, this is no fun. Like, I need to start paying money. Otherwise I won't be able to succeed anymore.
Definitely. And, I will say, like, I've used a couple of rental guns that were really in poor maintenance. And like, there's a point where that does start to be a, like, oh, this thing really doesn't work right at all.
Mhm.
So there is a, minimum of like, yeah, you need a working gun to have fun playing Airsoft, I think.
Yeah, no question. It's
But
like showing up for a race with only one sneaker.
yeah,
Like, I mean,
exactly. But
you can
like,
do it, but it's not going to be great.
you know, but beyond that, yeah, I mean, you can have fun playing Airsoft with a huge array of gear, of varying levels of sort of, in our view, efficacy.
Mhm. And you can be competitive with that equipment too,
Totally.
if your mindset and your approach to what you're doing is going to be in the right place. If you're approaching this from the angle of like, oh, well, my gear's not as good as other people's and everything sucks and I'm no good, like obviously that's not going to be a positive experience for you, right?
And I mean,
But
that's
if
a
you approach
mindset
it
that you need
from,
to address. Like,
well, yes, there's that too. But I mean, there's also this world where you can approach it from the other side and say, okay, I've got this piece of equipment, I've got these limitations, but let's operate within these limitations. Let's understand what I need to do. That's an opportunity for me to stretch myself in different ways. And in doing so, you can still be very competitive, despite the fact that you're not necessarily using the most expensive equipment, right?
for sure. At the end of last season, I had a day where, none of my shit was really working right. And I used Steph's PDRC, which is the size of a P90. Like it again, it's a partial weapon for my scale of frame. And
Mm-hmm.
it's unupgraded. Wasn't ineffective. Just meant I had to get closer to people, right?
Yeah.
The rules of suppress, use cover, flank don't change.
Only distances change.
Yeah, exactly. It's just the range at which I'm able to effectively
Totally.
suppress or hit a person. And I think that at
Yeah.
the end of the day, that's it, right? You can do most of the things you'd want to do with an unupgraded gun. Have I built upgraded guns for most of my teammates because we like the performance metric and it makes it, easier for us to be effective players? Yes, totally. So in that sense, unarguably, you can pay to gain mechanical advantage. But I will say, as sort of my closing thought on this, you will see lots of people go, oh, I put a new, 6.05 millimeter barrel in my gun and it made my gun shoot 400 meters and it's just completely busted. Those people are engaging in hyperbole. They don't actually know how to measure distance. We've talked about that a bunch. I'm not going to waste time getting into it here, but, be aware that people who are really hyping up their build on the internet have an invested reason to hype up that build.
Yeah, that's right.
The the M27 that I've built now does everything I want it to, pretty much, right? I'm still, picking up parts and tinkering with it because, as I've said a bunch of times, that's fun, right? How much further can I make this shoot? What else can I get this to do? Are questions I like asking about airsoft guns. I get a kick out of it. Am I at the point where I've put more money into this than I'm getting mechanical advantage out of? Yes, indisputably. Is that going to happen if you're doing HPA stuff? Yes. Are there benefits? Sure. If you guys are super interested, you can ask me about it on the Discord. You can send me messages. You can suggest that we do an episode about it, and we'll have a chat about why I do and don't like both versions of Airsoft gun. That's probably an episode that we'll do eventually anyway, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
But, does it give you enough mechanical advantage that you'll win every game, other than in the sense of, in my case, getting to giggle because my gun is fun to shoot? No. I do not win every firefight. I do not win every one-on-one duel. Do I win, more than average? Yeah, I've been doing this for a while and I have, some of the skills that are helpful for doing that.
Yeah, and I think, to close it out as a final thought, I see how effective your rifle is and how effective you are with your rifle. And do I think you're $2,000 more effective than you were, this time last year when you were using a Kythera, or this time, 2 years ago when you were using, well, I guess my rifle? um, and the answer is no, of course not. Right. And if that's going to be the reality of stuff, again, like, yes, there are scenarios where you're dropping, 13 grand on like thermals or whatever. And that's not what we're talking about here. You know, um, the money that you spend is not going to be proportional to the benefit that you gain. And in most cases, I would say too, it's not going to be even close, right? Some of the nice stuff that we have is nice because we like having nice stuff. Like I think about Pat's optic, for example, compared to a cheap airsoft optic. Yeah, it's way nicer to use. Mechanically speaking, it's not a whole lot more advantageous. Similarly, like, any piece of equipment that you point out, right? It's like, oh, well, that's a nice VDU. That's a nice, helmet. That's nice eye pro that doesn't fog, like all this kind of stuff. Yeah, we spent all this money on it. Mechanically speaking, can you get the same benefit from something that's cheaper? Probably. So my closing thought for you is, on the one hand, don't feel bullied into spending money that you don't have or money that you don't want to spend in order to gain some sort of advantage. If you're buying things, you should be doing so mindfully. If you're upgrading your gear, you should be doing that with a particular thing in mind, a particular objective in mind, right? You're trying to achieve something,
Definitely.
more accuracy, more range, whatever, and doing exactly what you need to do to get there. But it should never be from a point of pressure of, oh, well, if I don't do this, I won't be able to, quote unquote, keep up. Because for our money, when it comes to airsoft being pay to win, the answer is no, it is not. Because there's a lot more to airsoft than just the gear that you're using. There's skill, and then there's mindset that are two unavoidable and essential parts of being an effective player. There's no two ways about it.
Yeah. I would also, just because Phil sort of touched on it, and I really want to say it explicitly, there are diminishing returns to upgrading your airsoft gear. There are some upgrades that give you a lot, and then many of the other upgrades that we will talk about putting in are upgrades that dial it in very precisely. But in terms of, your play experience, are not necessarily giving you enormous benefit.
Yeah. Well, guys, thanks so much for tuning in this week. That's all we really have to say about pay to win. But if you do want to keep the discussion going, or if you have a dissenting opinion, we'd love to hear it. You can join us on the Discord. We'd love to have a chat. There's, as we've said many times, there's a completely international community in there, from people from the United States and Australia, the United Kingdom, Slovenia, and all around the world. So we would love to have you join. But until then, that's all we've really got for you. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks,
Take care.
everyone. Take care. Have a good week.